let me say, first of all, that I'm thrilled that anybody is interested in Israel Mattuck. And what I'm going to do is say briefly say why I'm interested in him, then make a what I think is a prejudicial, but I think an accurate assessment in one sentence. Then I'm going to say a little bit about his life, very briefly, and then I want to look at his views through some of his sermons, all of which are unpublished or were unpublished until very recently. They lay in collections in either the London Metropolitan Archive or the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St John's Wood, or the Learbeck College. But let me begin at the beginning by saying this. I come from a classical, what I would call Mattuck style liberal Jewish family. My father only ever spoke about one of the three M's, namely Israel Mattuck. Now, you will have learned, because I know that Andrew Goldstein introduced you to Claude Montefiore, and last week Jackie Tabbick introduced you to Lily Montagu. You may well be aware that liberal Jews talk about the three founding M's: Claude Montefiore, Lily Montagu, and Israel Mattuck. I am going to suggest to you that of the three of them, Liberal Judaism would not have developed as it developed, in my view, successfully, without the impact and the import of Israel Mattuck. That is not to diminish either Claude Montefiore or Lily Montagu, but what they had in common was they were both English, and to some extent, despite their perceived radicalism, they came from and were in some ways more traditionally inclined than Mattuck himself. As you know, Claude Montefiore was heavily involved with the West London Reform Synagogue, and Lily Montagu came from an Orthodox family and was quite traditional in her practice, despite her essentially working to found Liberal Judaism. I guess that if it would be fair to say, Montefiore provided, if you like, certainly provided the money, probably, and certain or connections to money, and what I call the establishment. He came from a very distinguished Anglo-Jewish family. Lily Montagu undoubtedly was the organizer. Those of you who've ever seen her letters in her spindly handwriting, she was an amazing organizer from her own home across not only England, but into the Commonwealth and indeed around the world. And I think that Israel Mattuck was the one who provided what I would call the intellectual background to what made Liberal Judaism a successful movement, certainly in the 1920s and 30s. I will not talk about later after Mattuck died in 1954. There are three personal reasons why I took an interest in Mattuck. The first is that my father, if I didn't say this already, forgive me, only ever spoke about Mattuck. He didn't really speak about Lily Montagu or about Claude Montefiore, but he certainly spoke about Mattuck, who confirmed him when he was 17. And my father then taught at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St John's Wood, for 50 plus years in the religion school, of which I'm a graduate. Mattuck, of course, was the first Liberal rabbi in this country and the first rabbi at the LJS St John's Wood. So that's the second connection. And the third connection is that I noticed that there was one biography of Claude Montefiore. Of course, there's now two, but there was one by an academic called Daniel Langton. There were a couple of biographies of Lily Montagu, but there was nothing about Israel Mattuck. And so I set out to do some research, primarily looking at his sermons, I've said most of which were unpublished. So that's my introduction. Let me now say something about briefly about his life. And there may be some of you who met him. I, of course, never met Israel Mattuck. He died in 1954, and I wasn't born until 1961. So I never met him. But there may well be people in the room now. Jane Rain, I see Jane Rain, Andrew and Sharon Goldstein, others who met him, but I never met him. So I just say that in passing. But he was born in a traditional Lithuanian family, a traditional Jewish Lithuanian family, in either 1883 or 1884. There seems a bit of controversy about the date. And as you know, there are all sorts of reasons why people initially in that time and in that place didn't register their births. Partly because they thought the deaths would occur fairly quickly and they wouldn't need to register them at all. And secondly, there was always a debate about the later you could register somebody, the later they would enter the Tsarist army if they were conscripted in that way. So, but in the 1880s, the early 1880s, he was born. And what we do know is that in 1891, his mother and his four brothers arrived in the United States, because we can check on the ship logs to find that out. The family were clearly aspirational, if I can put it that way. Two of the brothers went to Brown University, and the other three, including Mattuck, went to Harvard. And at Harvard, where Mattuck entered in 1901, he studied German and Semitics, and one of his teachers was the famous author George Foot Moore. And so he obviously did well there at Harvard. And I think when he joined HUC in Cincinnati, he was rather disappointed with the academic standards compared to Harvard. There's a big debate, not for us to have today, about the quality of some of the teaching that was received at Cincinnati. Not the quality of the teachers. The teachers were very fine, but put it crudely, if I might, apologies to all of my colleagues, the seminary was not training academics. It was training young, very young, teenage, sometimes beginning in the teenage rabbis for American congregations. And Mattuck clearly was identified early as a bright guy, and he fell out with the college authorities on a number of occasions. In fact, he left it at least once, and he was supposed to do by negotiation a 3-year residence at HUC, which he probably never completed. He also never wrote a proper rabbinic thesis, which we were able to discover when we looked at some of the minutes in the American archives. He wrote a paper on the Sibylline oracles, which would not have sufficed as a rabbinic thesis, but he was a rebellious student and had already begun working as a rabbi, even though he couldn't use that title because he hadn't yet been ordained. First at B'nai Yeshurun in Lincoln, Nebraska, 1906 to 8, where I've been. Then to B'nai Abraham in Portsmouth, Ohio, until May 1909. And then to Temple Israel in Far Rockaway in New York, where he joined in September 1909. He was all those 3 posts, by the way, he took before he was a rabbi. So he wasn't supposed to take the post. The rule were that you were supposed to be a graduate of the seminary before you took these posts. But Mattuck, being the type of person that he was, rebellious to say the least, managed to take these posts, and indeed was the rabbi in Far Rockaway in New York when he was ordained in 1910. 1910 was a big year for him. He was ordained on the 16th of, or granted smicha by Hebrew Union College on the 16th of April 1910. And in the same year, he married his wife, his only wife, who outlived him, if I remember correctly, Edna Mayer, whom he married in November 1910. He was identified as a high flyer, I suspect, although at the time he was a small fish in a rather big pool. But by chance, in 1911, Claude Montefiore, the first of the M's, accompanied by Charles Singer, went to the States to see if they could find a rabbi for the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in St. John's Wood, which they opened in that year. Mattuck was interviewed in June 1911, and although I don't think it's particularly well known, he was not the first choice. But the person who was invited to take the post, I believe that if I remember correctly, his wife decided that she didn't want to move to England, and thus at the very beginning of 1912, Mattuck arrived as the first liberal rabbi in this country, the first rabbi of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St. John's Wood, and delivered his first sermon on the 20th of January, 1912. And from 1912 until till his death in 1954, a little bit before his death, he continued to preach regularly at the LJS St. John's Wood, and was one of the few rabbis in this country, other than the Orthodox chief rabbi, to hold the title rabbi. You may or may not know it's not very important, although a number of people raised the issue, how and why could he call himself rabbi? Most of the rabbis in this country were not ordained as rabbis in the same sense. The chief rabbi used the term rabbi, and others used the term reverend. The problem, and as did the Reform officiants, most of them. But Mattuck arrived as a rabbi, having been ordained in the United States, and used the term for which he was attacked in a number of papers. That was not the only reason he was attacked for. He was attacked for his radical views on a number of things, which I hope we'll come to in just a moment. So that's my introduction, and I now want to look at some of his sermons. And so in a moment, you're going to see, you'll be able to get this document later on if you wish to have it. They're mainly extracted from my little book, Israel Mattuck, The Inspirational Voice of Liberal Judaism. They're reprinted there, but they're taken from his unpublished sermons, many of which were written by hand, and a number of which were typed, probably by one of his loyal secretaries, a woman called, it escapes me, it'll come back to me in a minute. I actually knew her, but it's just gone out of my head. Anyway, I suppose he was most known for his politics, and he lived, of course, in a fascinating time, didn't he? He lived through the First World War. He was active through the First World War. He lived through the Second World War. He just about, he lived to see the State of Israel founded and all the debates around Zionism. And by the way, with Mattuck and with Montagu and Montefiore, he founded the World Union for Progressive Judaism in 1926 at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St. John's Wood. The World Union, which is now dominated by America for all sorts of reasons in terms of numbers and people, was founded by the 3Ms in London, and will celebrate its 100th anniversary, I hope, in London in 1926. Anyway, I want to look just at a few of his sermons. Obviously, I will read them out to you because it's too difficult to get, when we've got this number of people on, to get individuals to read them. And I'll make some comments as we go along. He said what he thought needed to be said about the future of Judaism without fear or favor of how it would be received, even by his own congregants, never mind by the Jewish press and the Jewish establishment and other people. He was, although he wasn't completely unemotional, in most of his Judaism, he was what I would call a rational. But he was, like people of all of that generation, infused with God. He spoke about God in particular ways, as particularly did Lily Montagu and Claude Montefiore. And he spoke about God in a way that, dare I say this, to many liberal, reform, progressive Jews, many of our rabbis perhaps don't. I will deal with Zionism, which thank you to Howard and Michelle, who I've just seen have asked me a question about Zionism. Let's at least look at a couple of his texts to begin with, to get us off the ground. I've obviously chosen texts. I've chosen ones that I like or speak to me, or I think say something about him. From what I read about the cousinhood, if you like, the Jewish establishment, he was speaking to the LJS, which was a well-heeled congregation in the 1920s, 1930s. Quite establishment, I would say. Quite socially aware. I mean, if I dare say, make comparison there with what used to be called one nation conservatism with a small c. I'm not saying they were conservatives. What I'm saying is they had a social conscience, but there was once a controversy when he invited somebody who was a known communist to speak at the synagogue, and fell out with the synagogue about whether this person was allowed to speak, for example. But anyway, let's look at his sermons. I mean, here he, for once, decides he needs to justify himself, although he says he's not justifying himself, as I read in this first one. This was given in October 1931. It is not necessary to justify before this congregation the discussion from the pulpit of a subject that is primarily economic. You have given me evidence on other occasions that you agree with me in the view that religion must consider all matters that have a spiritual, moral, or social significance. Poverty is an economic fact, yet a social evil. Now, he says, I don't really need your permission, but I'm just reminding me you've given me permission and you agree with me that there's nothing we shouldn't discuss. And he's not party political ever. Um, at least I don't have an example of being party political that I found, but he's certainly political, as we'll see as we go through. So that was the first one. There's his introduction. Nothing as far as him being the preacher and freedom of the pulpit. He was prepared to say whatever he wanted to say. That, of course, like any rabbis, he felt had to be in accord with Jewish teaching or Jewish ethics. So that's the opening statement. Now, as you will remember, there were a number of industrial disputes in the 1920s, of course, culminating in a general strike. And again, the reason I picked this is I like his style. He says, "It is, I suppose, fair to assume that some of us here, as a proportion of all congregations, come to public worship with a desire for removal from the affairs of the world to the point of complete forgetfulness." Now, I think that's a very clever statement by a preacher. Not whether you agree with him or not. Don't look at whether you agree with him or not. But look how he tries to draw his audience in, even those he knows are going to object to what he might say. I mean, I think it's rather nice. But then he goes on to say, "But because I believe that the aim of worship is not to forget the world, but to illumine it." So he's not, if I put this, he's not such a touchy-feely, I'm going to put this very crudely, I don't mean it, meditative, let me put it as nicely as I can, meditative style of religion. He's going to say, but to illumine, not to obscure the problems of life, but to help find a way of solution for them. Not to conceal difficulties, but to increase strength to face them. It becomes my duty to maintain as best I can a relation, a contrast between our worship and the outside world. Even if it is full of things and happenings we should gladly forget if we might. So this is his style. I'm not saying there aren't other styles which are much more meditative and might want to look internally and all sorts of other styles. But Mattuck's very clear what his style is. You come to my shul, you come to hear my sermons, and you're going to hear about the nitty-gritty, including, I don't know if I've included this one, the Jewish landlords are ripping off tenants in the East End. And that's what he's the type of thing he says. And some who do not know before have learned since the war, when they found themselves more and more working in social government affairs side by side with just ordinary working men. He makes the point, a sociological point, of course, that the First World War began to break down the class barriers in the United Kingdom. I was going to just say England, and I remembered that I just want to say one other thing about Mattuck. I'm not aware that Mattuck went to Scotland, but in most places where Mattuck went in the United Kingdom, a liberal Jewish shul was founded afterwards. I mean, where he made a major speech trying to do so. So the shul in Brighton, the shul in Birmingham, the shul in Liverpool, these are liberal, were they may not be all now. Some of them, Liverpool's gone, was now Reform shul. At Dublin, these were all places where Mattuck was the speaker for a group of people who wanted Mattuck to hear Mattuck speak. So they invited him over, and he went to give one of these styles of sermons and addresses where he hoped to found a liberal community. The only place where I can find that he actually failed, which is why I call Wales a barren land for Liberal Judaism, was that he went to Cardiff, I think it was Cardiff, and did not have success there. But many of the out of London liberal Jewish, large outer London synagogues founded in the 1930s, 40s were where Mattuck went to give an address. It was often followed up by Lily Montagu with administration and then the nurturing and the softer side and so on. But that was Mattuck. So I cannot help feeling that many of us, perhaps without really knowing it, form our judgment with the feeling that the working man is an inferior being, less reasonable, perhaps even less civilized than ourselves. Now, this is a courageous thing to say to a congregation of probably not working class men. Right? He's speaking to a middle class community, and he reminds them, because they're middle class is not a reason for them not to take an interest in what's going on outside. Fairness, he says, requires that we see them for what they are, human beings quite like ourselves. You wouldn't have thought that was a very radical thing to say, but I suppose he nevertheless said it. That may be good, bad, or indifferent, but the same nature desires reasons work in all of us, and we all respond to the same ideal. I think that gives you an idea. This is quite an early sermon. This is 1913, The Ideals of Labour. Uh, I mean, it's a bit, well, it's sweet. The association of labour with the ideal means that the humblest piece of work, a great purpose may express itself, and it may conduce to the achievement of some great goal. You may have heard of the young housemaid who was asked by a good parson what she was doing for God, and she answered, I sweep the corners clean. There is a great truth revealed in this humble answer. The lowliest act, when done with the intent of serving a great cause, becomes a great act. The cobbler who pegs at his shoes, or the tailor who works his needle, feeling they are doing a service to society and helping to clothe human beings. The mechanic who forges a plough, and the farmer who drives it into the soil, with the consciousness they are helping to supply an answer to human wants, are transfiguring their work and ennobling it by the consciousness of their social service they are doing. Rather sweet, and I thought I'd leave it in rather. I was going to take it out, so I did. I'd leave it in. Let's move to the next one. He reports in one of his sermons passing a group of homeless or jobless people with placards. I think it's in Oxford Street, if I remember correctly. And he says, if we are not disturbed individually as well as collectively by the problem of unemployment, we ought to be. It is an economic and industrial and political problem, but more of all of these, it is a human problem. He might have said the word religious problem, but he didn't. Just this one on the challenge to our religious institutions is industrial unrest. This is 1913, again another early one. As the existence of sin is a challenge to the regenerating powers of goodness, so is existence of social ills is a challenge to influence social good, which religion may possess. He really believes that religion, and of course, particularly for him, Liberal Judaism, can have a social impact for the betterment of individuals and for the society as a whole, which in some ways makes him radical as a preacher and as makes him political. But let's have a look what he says in 1930 about Russia. The Russian Revolution has taken place 1905 and then 1917, and the communist government is now in full swing with all its idealism and all its negative things about it. But he makes this comment in a sermon. Communism is, that's my words, a daring experiment. Some would say foolish experiment, but a challenging experiment. Sympathetically interesting were it not for the price being paid with lives or souls. Communism has always been atheistic. The denial of private property rights has been combined with the rejection of God. The connection is not logically obvious. Historically, the Essenes and the early Christians based their communism on the worship of God. The leaders of Russia have deserved our respect because they are working to create a better world. Their methods may be foolish, their plans merely vague fumblings of visionaries, their intensity merely the bigotry begotten of bitterness, but they are sincere in their desire for a better world. They do not seem to know what that religion is necessary for a better world. Now, this is not untypical, by the way, of many Jews who, when they first came to this country in the late 19th century and 20th century, were involved in left-wing movements, communism, forms of left-wing and anarchism, and indeed trade unionism, even though often trade unions rejected them because they were fearful they were taking jobs. They believed initially, I mean, of course, there were many people who believed till Stalin, that the Russian Revolution had something of value to offer, particularly to Jews, but not only to Jews. And this is an interesting comment by him, and why I guess some people said he was really a communist. He just wanted to be a religious communist, a communist with religion, rather. I'm not sure that's a fair criticism, but nevertheless, the sermon is there for you to decide how you might respond to it were it delivered and you were there in 1930. Okay, let's move on and see what else we've got that I want to make comment on. I mean, it's quite brave. The Foundation of a New World, and Rosh Hashanah 1941, right? This is the middle of the Second World War. He says something about Russia. He acknowledges, which of course was acknowledged at the end of the Cold War by some people who were suspicious of Russia, but also that in the end, the Second World War might not have been won without the support of Russia. That's not to say Russia was all good or anything like that, but what Mattuck acknowledges is, quote, by her magnificent resistance to German invasion, by the superb heroism of her forces and people, and the tremendous tragic sacrifices. Remember how many Russians were killed during defeating Nazis, for whatever reason they had. That was the reality. They made an immense contribution to victory. And then he says, but what about where's the role of religion? And he says Russia's relation to religion is somewhat complicated. They're no less religious as individuals, but of course it's and I'm not going to go on. You can read the rest at some other time. The strain of the war is responsible in considerable measure for the prejudice harboured by some people against the Jews. We remain some of the arguments by which this prejudice tries to justify it. How, we ask, can people believe such palpable falsehoods as a statement there are 2 million Jews in England, or such plain rubbish Jews are the power behind everything? Well, what's changed? Okay. Though, I mean, I'm not assuming that everybody on this call is Jewish, but a lot of people will be Jewish or involved in the Jewish community. Um, and still, if you ask people how many Jews there are in England, they won't tell you 250,000. I'll tell you that. They'll tell you many more. Of course, where the power behind everything is a common accusation which you still hear today. I remember when I first went to the Home Office, convened a rabbis and Muslims um, convocation, and a very, I thought, quite intelligent young imam started talking about, how disappointed he was that the Palestinians and Muslims never got proper rights in the Jewish media, and in the media. And they said, well, it's all owned by them, by the Jews, including, he said, Rupert Murdoch. And when I reminded Rupert Murdoch was a Catholic, he didn't believe me, first of all. So people's capacity to believe propaganda and possibility to believe palpable nonsense, as Mattuck says, was as prevalent in his time as it is today. I move on from that very quickly, so I don't get drawn into anything I shouldn't be drawn into. He wasn't a pacifist. He supported the war effort very strongly, but his ultimate conclusion, enduring peace will not come by an increased destructive power, but by prophetic vision, is what the Hebrew prophet, partly what the Hebrew prophets were preaching, namely that I'm not making this as a modern defense comment, but that threatening people and having bigger weapons than the next person may not ultimately lead to the type of solution that religious people want. I'll say no more comment than that. I put this one in because it's completely different from most other things that I could find, just for interest. Mattuck worked very closely with Lily Montagu, and as you may remember, one of the few women preaching. She preached at the LJS very regularly. She preached in South London, where my family were involved, South London Liberal. She preached in Berlin. So she was, in some senses, a sort of quasi-rabbi or a para-rabbi. Of course, there was no seminary for the training of British rabbis, progressive rabbis, reform or liberal, until 1956, after Mattuck had died, till the college was founded, hence its 70th anniversary next year. I just put this in because, you see, he's even taking an interest in divorce laws because he sees that they breach what he believes is a Jewish religious principle. Obviously, he's a Jew, a Jewish religious principle of equality. So he says, equality of the sex is, to my mind, a cardinal principle in religious thought and in religious life. It doesn't say Jewish religious thought or Jewish religious life, but he associates himself with that. We can be equal and yet be different. A woman need not be like a man in order to maintain a position in every way equal to his. I'm afraid that the movement that went under the name of feminism, so not everybody will like this, has gone either too far or altogether wrong in confusing likeness with equality. The home has had to suffer for this. Women have felt it to be an expression of this desire for equality by imitating men in the attitude to life, by imitating him in thinking the greatest chance for the best work lies outside the home. She has intimated him even by thinking his vices are virtues. Now, by the way, the divorce laws were unfair to women, and that's what he was interested in. This comment is not today, would not be considered politically correct, if I can use that term. I'm trying to give you a wider view of Mattuck than just only his, what I call, God sermons or Judaism sermons or whatever. So anyway, we move on from that one. I don't want to dwell on it for very long. This is probably my favorite sermon. Somebody asked me, what impact did Mattuck have? Well, my type of Judaism that I've tried to practice and preach and lead is probably summed up by this, which I think is probably Mattuck's greatest statement. I mean, he had lots of great statements. He didn't write very many books, only 4 books, if I remember correctly. But I mean, this is just great. I mean, look at this. If Judaism is to exercise an influence in the world, the first thing is there's an assumption, which I agree with, and I think Liberal Judaism agrees with, I'm sure Reform Judaism, that Judaism is to exercise an influence in the world. But that isn't a given. There are plenty of Jews and Jewish sects, SEC sects, who might not agree with that. But he says, if Judaism is to exercise influence in the world, it must be something more than a tradition which some Jews like to maintain for their satisfaction. It must be a message to the world. Now, I don't want this to be misinterpreted. People tended to say that Mattuck wasn't interested in religious tradition, which is not true. He was not particularly interested in empty tradition or tradition in place of real agitation, if you like, or real thought. And he certainly was opposed to some traditions which he felt were anti-liberal or anti-equality and so on. But he wasn't opposed to religion, to tradition, by the way. But he was very fearful of Jews who hung on to their tradition and felt that was enough to make them their impact in the world. And this is what he says about Judaism. This is his real impact, in my view. It must be a message to the world. Right? This is not a message. In other words, what he's saying in a very prophetic way, in my view, is Judaism is not for Jews alone. Judaism has something to offer the world, a mission for the world. And he then says what it is. It must embody the thought, the ideas of men and women accept as true on sufficient ground. So there's no point rabbis and Jewish movements repeating Bubba Mises because they're traditional. He wants to take on board all the information, scientific knowledge, technological knowledge, advances that the world has, because that's the only way he believes you will actually persuade intelligent, and he was interested in intelligent people and modern people. You'll have a voice that they might listen to. He goes on to say, a bit more radically, it cannot have a message for the world of today if it clings to obsolete beliefs and ideals. Secondly, it must address itself to the problems that agitate our world. Not easy always to fulfill when you've got as a pulpit rabbi, when you've got to, please your congregants and lead your congregants and bring them with you. And, if you're too radical, they only see the dust on your heels. But I think this, for me, sums up where I think Mattuck really was. And I think that's where, in many of its historic phases, Liberal Judaism has been. And it's not for me to judge, but that's how I tried to lead the movement, because I thought that's what our raison d'etre was, and it may still be so for not only Liberal Judaism, but Reform Judaism, Progressive Judaism, and wider. But that, to me, to ask you, the person who asked me, what was Mattuck's influence, I think that that mode was picked up by other liberal rabbis, some of whom came from abroad, of course, and that's really the type of Judaism that I'm interested in. Rabbis were not as challenged then as they would be today. People gave respect to their rabbis, even if they disagreed with their views, and they didn't necessarily. So I think there was less internal opposition. I'm sure there was internal opposition, but certainly he was forever being hammered in the Jewish Chronicle and by Orthodox Judaism. So yes, he was certainly criticized by the rest of the Jewish community. But if liberal and reform progressive Judaism isn't being criticized by the mainstream Jewish community, it may have lost its role in any case. But he certainly was being criticized in that way. He certainly wasn't a Zionist, if you mean, and he was very exercised, as was most of the Jewish world before the Second World War, with the idea that all Jews would go and live in Israel. And there were a number of reasons for that. In Mattuck's radical case, it would be that he believed that Judaism would have its best effect if there were Jews all over the world. And one of the biggest ones was that it would increase anti-Semitism, not decrease it. That there was a view that argued that if you gave the Jews a state, then even more people would say, "See, you've got your own state. You're loyal to another state. Why don't you go there?" And Mattuck was very clear, as were many people before the foundation of the State of Israel, and following from the French Revolution. We are Jews of the. We are French. We are Frenchmen of the Mosaic persuasion. We are French Jews who want to participate as both full Jews and full Frenchmen. Now, obviously, the Second World War led to some disappointment in that argument, so he was certainly not an advocate of all Jews going to Israel, and dare I say this, the Balfour Declaration itself, which is a colonial document of some description, he would have said, even if he didn't like it, which we can have a debate about in a minute, did not in itself mean that there would be a Jewish state on its own. But we'll come to that in a minute. But let's have a look at what he says. On the evening of the Day of Atonement last year, the Arabs complained that the Jews had set up a screen at the Wailing Wall to separate the men and the women taking part in worship there, contrary to the official decision that there was to be no change at the Wailing Wall. That decision was actuated by the desire to avoid conflict between the Jews and Muslims about the possession of the wall. The Muslims saw in the screen on the Day of Atonement a change important enough for complaint. The British official forcibly removed it, leading to violent protests on the spot and to a series of protests by Jews elsewhere, especially Zionists. The Arabs retorted by diverse acts directed partly to emphasize their possession of the wall, partly to humiliate the Jews worshipping there. For centuries, Jews had worshipped individually and in groups at this wall, which they held particularly sacred because it was believed to be the only remaining portion of Solomon's temple. They had worshipped there unhindered and unmolested. So I'm not advocating this, but you begin to feel a bit sorry for the British officials who ended up. I don't know what date. Can you see what date this one was? 1930. So the Palestinian Mandate is now held by Britain, which is trying to hold the ring between increasingly demanding Jews and increasingly demanding Muslim Arabs. And he writes this: "We do not wish to hinder whatever Zionists are trying to do in Palestine. Above all, we would wish to establish in Palestine a safe home for as many Jews as possible of those who feel at present homeless. We can even sympathize with the Zionists in their special difficulties, although we do not sympathize with their special aims. And we all feel sadness, anger, and condemnation for the attacks. It is difficult to define exactly what is entitled to be called Jewish. But if Jewish means that which obtains to all Jews, the problems of Zionism cannot be called Jewish problems. And only a minority of Jews are attached to Zionism. I'm not arguing against Zionists, presumably Zionism or Zionists, I'm not sure. But I'm arguing against the tendency among Jews to equal Zionism with Judaism, and Zionists with Jews. In other words, and bear in mind this is long before the state has been formed. He died in 1954. We Jews like it both ways. We like to say that Judaism is not Zionism and Zionists are not Jews, and our enemies don't care less. But we find ourselves in a bit of a bind sometimes. And Mattuck is articulating that very strongly. But his view is that he does not object to a Jewish entity in Israel, but he does not watch that to be the totality of Judaism. Or the Jewish experience in the world. And he goes on to this, 1938. Palestine will yet have its part to play, and an important part. For the Zionist, it will be the centre of Jewish life. The dispossessed Jews of Eastern Europe may be an opportunity for some of them, but however much it may contribute to the life of universal Jewry, the main problem will have to be solved without relation to it." And goes on to say, "The problem was never solved for the Jewish people as a whole. Neither Jewish isolation nor discarding Judaism solves it. The first is secular nationalism, second leads to conversion of formal or informal to another religion. Both are bad kinds of assimilation. The first collective assimilation, the second individual. Both mean the loss of religious dignity which gives the Jews their value and makes their continued existence a contribution to the spiritual life and development of life. He saw Judaism as a faith, not as a national entity. He goes on to say again, even in 1944, a Jewish nation and a Jewish religion do not mean the same thing. There is a good ground for the fear that a Jewish political nation will weaken and worsen Jewish religion. That's an interesting question, which we might have an argument about. If the choice is secularism or Haredi Judaism in some places, maybe he's saying something that we didn't realize at the time. Jewish nationalism, like all nationalism, is secular. But the establishment can give no assurance that the sufferings will be avoided. For that, we must look to the spread of humanity and the institution of democracy on all lands. A Jewish nation will not itself overcome any of the dangers that confront the Jews in the world, though it may aggravate some of them. All the Jewish nation in Palestine could do is free from those dangers the Jews settle and live there. They cannot be more than a small part of the Jews of the world, and they may have to face dangers of another kind. Of course, that's no longer true, that now, something like 40%, maybe even higher, 50% of Jews live in the state of Israel. He's not an advocate of nationalism, which he sees as a secular way of thinking, and he sees Jewish nationalism, what we might call Zionism, in the same manner. He believes in Judaism as a universal faith, which should, as I say, be experienced in as many lands as possible to be experienced. So, he comes out of the early 19th century optimism. Wasn't it after the First World War there were going to be no more European wars? And look what happened. Let's see, what else have I got left? Now, he writes this in 1917. Look, the idea of nationality, apart from its intrinsic error, holds no promise for the future of the Jews, but that of a weak, ineffectual nationalism for a small fraction of them. While a larger number of them are left in the world to choose between remaining for all time alienated, I think that means, or separated from the Jewish people. So, until frankly, the Shoah, many Jews never imagined that, well, first of all, they never imagined that Jews would be destroyed in such large numbers, put to death in such large numbers, but could not have imagined that the majority of Jews would live in Israel. So let me just, in summary, say this. The first thing to say is that I do think Israel Mattuck was the most influential in many ways of the three founders of Liberal Judaism. I think he was a prophetic figure in many ways. And by the way, somebody once, I can't remember where this quote comes from, somebody once said to me that if you'd stood on the steps of the LJS in 1925, you would have thought that the world belonged to Liberal Judaism. And I don't say this in any way to detract from Reform Judaism and its greats, but Reform Judaism had the West London Synagogue, Bradford and Manchester, and that was about it until the 1930s. And the Reform themselves, as well as the Orthodox world, were nervous about, if I put it that way, or impressed with the progress of Liberal Judaism at the time. That the establishment of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, its own cemetery at Pound Lane, then the establishment of the North London Amherst Park, which was much more Zionist under Pearlsfy, by the way, much more Zionist than Mattuck. South London Liberal in 1929, Lily Montagu's West Central Club in 1923, people would have thought that the progressive future in this country belonged to Liberal Judaism. I say that just as an observation. We are where we are now, and I do believe the future of Judaism in this country now belongs to the new movement, to Progressive Judaism, to Liberal and Reform Judaism, because they are the only part of Judaism, I think, that really will be fulfilling Mattuck's dream of speaking to the problems which agitate the modern world. Now I am going to conclude and see if there's any questions. So question, what percentage of Jews are Orthodox, Progressive and Conservative? Well, do you mean how they think, how they behave, or how they belong to a shul? That's the first question. Today, probably only about, if we assume there's something like 200,000 Jews in this country, depends how you define what a Jew is, of course. Thank you, Rosie. You married your parents. about 80,000. I mean, half of them are not synagogues. So how do you define that, first of all? And I would say very large numbers of Jews outside of the Haredi community um, behave like liberal and progressive Jews. Um, that doesn't mean they join our synagogues, but that's actually how they behave in practice and what they really think if you pin them to the wall and ask them. But the truth of the matter is, the Jewish Communal Survey, thank you, of Howard Cohn had published, will tell you. But our movement, joint movement, will need to work very hard to speak to the problems of younger Jews today. Let me just make three other very quick points. First of all, I do believe one of his death was announced on national radio. That's how important he was. Number one. Number two, I believe that one of the services of the LJS, including his sermon, was recorded was put on the radio. But he was the founder, by the way, before the CCJ, the Council of Christian Jews, whatever they say. He was the founder of Jewish Christian Dialogue in this country, the London Society of Jews and Christians, which he founded, was a precursor. I think he founded in 1927. The Council of Christian Jews, which claims to be the oldest, was founded in 1942 by the then Archbishop of Canterbury. I think it was called Temple, if I remember correctly, and the then Hertz, the then United Synagogue Chief Rabbi. So he was a pioneer in Jewish Christian relations. And I suspect if he lived today, he would have been a pioneer in Jewish Muslim relations. But it's always dangerous to say things about somebody who's dead. They would have thought this, they might have done that, because we really don't have any idea. There we are, Howard Cohn. Haredi 7%, Orthodox 12, Traditional 27, Reform Progressive 18. So, there we are. Thank you, Howard, for that.
I don't think there are any more questions, so I
Great.
think we will conclude here. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, but particularly a very big thank you to Rabbi Danny for this absolutely wonderful session. In fact, Danny, I know that you've used about half of your material, so maybe that's enough for a session 2 at some point. So thank you everyone. Join us again next week when Rabbi Mark Goldsmith will be talking about Ignace Maybaum.